which was the result of the... I think it would have been worth commenting if they did not comment on us. The meeting of NATO heads of state and government in Washington, which took place on July the 9th to July the 11th, was intended to demonstrate the transatlantic unity of the collective West in the year of the 75th anniversary of NATO. The indentation of a wide range of partners was ostensibly an endorsement and firm support of the North Atlantic Bloc's activities, which is still unfortunately permeated by a Cold War mentality. But unfortunately, something went completely wrong. Russia was once again declared a threat to the bloc in all operating environments, as they put it. However, it did not look celebratory, but let's get into details. Bearing in mind the fact that our country was once again chosen as some kind of a target, we continue with the original plans aimed at countering Russia on the eastern, northern and southern flanks. The US and its allies have approved further steps to militarize the European continent, build out the capacities of a military-industrial complex, and accumulate military capabilities near Russia's borders. Washington hustled up and announced the deployment of intermediate-range and shorter-range missiles on German territory, and let me remind you that they are banned under the Treaty of the Elimination of Intermediate-Range and Shorter-Range Missiles. The long-term objective of NATO, as we put it, remains to inflict a strategic defeat in Russia, as they put it. At the same time, quote-unquote, they declared that the fate of democracy, quote-unquote, is being decided on the battlefield of the Ukrainian conflict. What kind of democracy is that? You know, what we see in the West, this is like some kind of a dictatorship of liberalism, and in Ukraine, it's just nationalism. We have said numerous times during this summit that the outcome of the whole thing will allegedly determine the future of global security. The biggest risk for NATO is the possibility of victory of Russia, and the alliance, another quote, cannot allow this to happen, end of a quote. Apparently, there are fears for the fate of the alliance itself in case of the unfortunate outcome of a special military operation. This alliance seems to still wait for Ukraine, but it is quite evident that all of this looks more and more like a game. And it's not Ukraine that we're playing with. We're playing with the remains of Ukraine. We still see the reality, and the reality looks like this. NATO still uses Ukraine as expendable material in geopolitical confrontation with Russia. The decisions made at the summit are designed to encourage the Ukrainians to continue fighting. And I'm talking about those Ukrainians who still remain at the territory of Ukraine, who have not been caught at their homes. The issue of Kyiv's accession to the alliance and the ostensible unity what they were trying to demonstrate was basically cracking at the seams. Just listen to what they said. The media published details of disagreements between the alliance member states over the amount and timing of Ukraine's financing and the process of its accession to NATO. On the eve of the summit, this was the subject of a public address by 60 authoritative American political scientists. They urged, I don't know who they urged, the NATO countries themselves, NATO as an alliance with Washington as its head, not to bring Kyiv closer to the membership in the bloc. As I have already said, something went terribly wrong at this anniversary summit. And all of this pleasant atmosphere failed. And what was the outcome? Kyiv regime was promised an quote-unquote irreversible road, quote-unquote, to the alliance. And frankly speaking, I don't know what kind of irreversible road this could be. I think the only association what we have is the road to the abyss. Now we want to kind of illustrate what we're talking about, and they give it a new name. The new name is a breach to the alliance. However, we are yet to determine how long this breach is going to be. But I will open a military secret to the Kyiv regime. It is indeed a breach, but still this breach can be opened from any point of view, because basically at any moment when it is beneficial to the West, we will raise this breach, and when it is beneficial to the West once again, nobody's going to ask the Kyiv regime over Ukraine where it can be put down. And this is what it's going to look like time and again. And yet there is also another symbolism to this, because indeed we are fooling the Ukrainians with this association of the bridge, but they do not want to admit to that. This shows that the United States and its allies see NATO as the main instrument in the struggle to preserve world hegemony in the form of a notorious rule-based order. They seek to prevent the establishment of a multipolar world by all means. And all those who pursue an independent sovereign policy and are not ready to obey instructions from Washington are declared opponents or enemies. The ambitions to rule the world, as the United States President stated, are camouflaged by the need to, as they put it, to defend democracy against the alleged authoritarian alliance of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. This is malarkey, because what kind of democracy we want to defend, I do not understand. I think democracy should only be defended from the NATO countries and Washington, but we're going to get back to that later. To stick to their own definition of defending democracy, Washington and its allies intend to extend cooperation with like-minded countries, primarily the Pacific Four: Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan. We are taking steps to strengthen their influence in different areas of this region, which we have already talked about. However, we are also targeting the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Let me remind you that this is the Northern Atlantic Alliance. What on earth is it doing in different parts of the world? If you hear them say once again that we are guaranteeing something or strengthening their security, guaranteeing something to the new allies, just remember who have they ever kept their promise to? Have they ever helped anyone maintain their security? Have they ever helped anyone reverse the catastrophic resolvement of a situation? Have they ever felt them with some kind of a post-conflict reconstruction or fights in international terrorism? Have you ever heard them do any of the kind? No, no. The only thing they are good at is catastrophes. And despite all the attempts to showcase NATO's achievements over the 75 years of its existence, they still failed, and it went the other way around, because there are simply no achievements to boast about. All the activities of the North Atlantic Alliance are still limited exclusively to escalated confrontation with Russia, which is they give different names to that, like non-constructive relations or a different part of the history or the acts of evil. But we are basically talking about those countries who don't want to adhere by the rules. But still, the majority of efforts of NATO are still limited on total elimination of a construction of security in Europe. It is already in ruins, and it looks like they want to do away with what is left. The aggressive rhetoric and provocative actions are driving the alliance into a deadlock from which there is no way out. So they say that Russia is basically an existential threat to them, but in fact, we're doing everything we can to come to an end, and it looks like NATO has no prospects, and the summit in Washington only confirmed this once again. But the main piece of news of the NATO summit was, and this will come as a surprise to you, was something which shattered the United States and basically the whole world. And I'm talking about the mental and cognitive state of the current United States president. I must admit that it's of no business of MFAs of different countries, but for the State Department of US. But still, what American President Joe Biden was talking about at the summit, addressing not only his personal problems or not NATO agenda, but basically everything, different countries, different peoples, different nations, talking about the global problems of humanity. So this is what we as an MFA should address. The natural reaction of the world majority, which came several hours after this very speech, was basically the biggest piece of news and the biggest sensation of a NATO summit. The State Department and the United States administration probably wanted this summit to showcase Joe Biden's competency as a president and as a candidate for president, but it just turned the other way around. I think it only aggravated the situation, especially after President Biden said that Vladimir Putin was the president of Ukraine and Trump the vice president of the US, who had the potential to become the president. What does this tell us? It looks like the whole world sees a horrible scene of merging of the American statehood as official structures and the Western media, which are labeled as mainstream. We have been hiding the real situation in the White House for quite a while. We have been hiding this from the general public, and we have manipulated with data on the health of the American president. And it's in the same way what we are hiding the reality around the situation in Ukraine from the American public. We also try to manipulate with the opinion of the general public on what the United States really did on the territory of Ukraine. We conducted military and anti-constitutional coup d'etats, they changed regimes, they sponsored domestic changes in Ukraine so that in the long run we could start yet another conflict on the European continent. I would like to highlight this once again. It looks like the very deep state and the mainstream media, the biggest media of the United States, are basically merging into one, manipulating information around health, physical as well as mental, of American president. And it's in the same way, in the same fashion, that we're manipulating with the international agenda. And the more we do that, the more horrible the picture looks like. And it doesn't look like it's basically merging. It's just with the propaganda machine and the statehood are basically one at this moment. We have been seeing this for quite a while. And when it comes to Russia, the same thing happens to manipulating the general public in the United States in order to demonize Russia. And we see the same thing happening to American, British, and other media which are under control of Washington and London when it comes to talking about the conflict in Ukraine. And it's in the same fashion what we have been hiding real facts about the cognitive and mental state of the current American president. It's in the same fashion what we are hiding of who is striking against the Zaporozhye gas station. They make it seem that we do not know who shells the station, but later on, when it turns out that it is quite clear, we try to put it so that was not the armed forces of Ukraine, but some other kind of force who shelled the gas station. For many years, the American media have been manipulating the information about the health of President Biden. In the same fashion, we acted when we covered the situation in Ukraine and talked about the lack of nationalism and Russophobia there. We knew that it was very much there, and we knew that the American government sponsored it, basically fueling this Russophobia, but still we pretended that we didn't know nothing about it. And now, in full force, we are doing the same thing with President Biden. They claim that he's very much capable and intelligent behind closed doors. In the same fashion, they say that the Zelenskyy regime is a legitimate one. They give us examples which have nothing to do with reality. We basically want to strengthen the legal side of their connections with Ukraine. Look at the way the Brussels-associated media manipulate with news about the health of Joe Biden. Then it will become clear, you will understand the way they treat information on the national agenda. And the problem is not only that we do not know how they're going to deal with the upcoming elections, the problem is that they are pretty sure that the institutionalized machine of lies will work under any circumstances. But no matter what they do, be it the occupation of Iraq, be it the destruction of Libya, or the anti-constitutional coup d'etat in Ukraine, or fueling the conflict in Europe, we think that they will get away with anything if they can only go live on their own channels. They think that the whole world will see the picture they want the world to see, but in the era of multipolarity and transnational media as well as social networks, it is not possible. We see the doomed face of Antony Blinken all over the internet. We also see pictures of a National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who was watching in horror what Joe Biden was talking about. Yes, it's mostly lies, and they cannot hide it anymore. And it looks like they're going to drown in their own propaganda in terms of Ukraine. And more about the outcomes of this NATO summit, but we also noted the arms deliveries to the Kyiv regime, and which now amounts to about $1 billion. And the question arises, it's just interesting, do we think that it's the same President Biden who signs all these kinds of checks and the bills? Is it him who wants to deliver this kind of arms, this amount of arms to Ukraine? The very same President Biden who doesn't know what country he's talking about, what president he's talking about. Does he give out billions of dollars? Who doesn't even know what his competitor in the upcoming elections is his very own predecessor? Of course, it looks like you can give him pretty much anything to sign, but the question is who does this and what for? We understand that this is just some total large-scale corruption around the situation in Ukraine, but we drew attention to the statements about new large-scale deliveries of weapons to the Kyiv regime. It was announced that they are going to transfer various air defense systems, including the outdated Patriot systems, but at the same time, the countries of a collective fast continue to increase pressure that states would possess stocks of Soviet weapons and ammunition with a view to further transfer them to the Kyiv regime. In doing so, the provisions of end-user certificate are often flagrantly violated, and the key provision is between admissibility of re-exporting arms without the written consent of exporting country is prohibited. Large-scale arm transfers to Ukraine by NATO and European Union countries and their satellites, including their most dangerous lethal systems, including ballistic missiles and long-range multiple-launch rocket systems, air systems, and a wide range of armored vehicles and artillery, are being carried out in violation of your own international legal and political obligations under a number of multilateral agreements.
This was an international legal agreement. They are now not just passing by, but just they step over that. And the common position of the European Union, it's a name of the document. It's not just symbolic name, it's just the official name of the document. That's how the official position of the European Union is called. It sets the rights for control over the export of military technology and equipment. And this treaty includes the ban to supply arms if they are used for the acts of genocide, crimes against humanity, and grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of 1949, attacks against civilians or civilian population. It's Article 6. With regard to the statements that the Kyiv regime is not committing any crimes, they also think that President Biden is good to act. So it violates the provisions on arms transfer and leads to there is a ban if it leads to violations of international law, provokes conflicts on the territory of the recipient country, or some hostile actions against third parties. Risks of unagreed re-export and weapons ending up in illegal trafficking, those risks should also be considered. And according to the Europol, there are such risks already, and the situation with the violation of international commitments, murders of journalists, mass repressions by the Kyiv regime of their own public figures and representatives of civil society, they are not taken into account. Now the situation of the Ukrainian crisis in general. Terror actions are continued against the civilian population, cities and villages by the Kyiv regime. In order to provide some services for Washington, and in exchange, the West provides weapons because it's part of that election campaign. The inhabitants of the White House are betting on. On the 3rd of July, a bread factory in Aloshki of Kherson region was attacked. 2 employees were killed, 1 employee was wounded. It was the only bakery producing bread for the inhabitants of the city. So those human rights, allegedly human rights, pro-Western organizations, do they not understand that? They do understand, but it's acceptable for them. On the 4th of July, the Banderites threw explosives from the UAV at 2 cars in the Borisov district of the Belgorod region. 4 people were wounded, including a child. The same day, they used a copter for the attack at the residential house in Totkino of the Kursk region. A woman was wounded. On the 5th of July, A house was attacked in the Krasnodar region in Primorsko-Akhtarsk. A 6-year-old girl died, 16 people were wounded, including a child. That very day in Volnovakha, 5 civilians were killed, 24 were wounded, and 2 Russian emergency workers were wounded. For 2 days, from the 8th till the 10th of July, the Banderite massively attacked the Belgorod region. Around 20 people were wounded. Russian law enforcement bodies keep the record of the crimes of the Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Everyone will be brought to responsibility and prosecuted. Yesterday, one more terror attack planned by the Kyiv regime aimed only targeted exclusively against children and deliberately conducted by the Kyiv regime. Now the crimes prosecuted, the punishments for the crimes, the Russian courts continue to sentence the Ukrainian criminals. A militant of the Ukrainian army, Filipov, was sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes in Mariupol. He fired at 3 civilians, including a child, who were going in a car. A Ukrainian Nazi Kazimov was sentenced, who in 2019 ordered to shoot at civilians in Chermalik, Oktyabr, and Kominternovo in the Donetsk People's Republic. Those who followed his orders are also sentenced to longer imprisonments. Banderite Chernomor, who ordered to shoot at civilians in Mariupol, under suspicion of their cooperation with the Russian army, and those who followed his orders were also sentenced, and a French mercenary Quest was also sentenced to 14 years of imprisonment. Zinovy Persuk was sentenced by the Moscow City Court together with his son, ex-deputy of the Verkhovna Rada Vladimir Persuk. He trespassed the Consul General of Russia in Lviv. He tore away the Russian flag, and for that crime he was sentenced in absentia to 11 years of penal colony. No Ukrainian criminals or their supporters will be able to escape punishment. They will be held accountable to the full extent of the law. According to the Global Center of Geographical Information and Sustainable Development of the Kyiv Polytechnical Institute, named after Sikorsky, they have presented scenarios of flooding the neighboring territories neighboring to the Dnieper. This institute had already modeled the flooding of the Kakhovka hydro plant. Now these objects of study of this institute are the Kanaev and Kyiv hydroelectric power plants. The flooding area will be up to 2,000 square kilometers, according to that institute. 76 settlements will be flooded, not buildings, but settlements. The number of victims will be up to 900,000 people, 90% of which are the residents of the capital, the residents of Kyiv. During the flooding of the Kanaev reservoir, it's according to the Sikorsky Institute will be up to 4,000 square kilometers, and the zone affected will cover 177 settlements. The residents of Kyiv and Cherkasy will suffer. It is obvious that the Zelenskyy regime is conducting another provocation against its own population in order to again invent a story that will be imposed on global community on ecocide, crimes by allegedly our country, attempts to beg for assistance and to cover their own terrorist activities. And Kyiv regime much favors the children issue. They continue to exploit this issue, forgetting about the real situation. They present fake stories about broken families, bitter fate of children who dream to return to Ukraine. What is done in order for such stories to be believed? Fake declarations that the children were deprived of names, language, culture, had to fight for Russia against Ukraine. And they repeat the statements about the necessity of the return of young Ukrainians to their families and legal guardians, but they keep silent the work of the Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. Recently, a Commissioner for Human Rights of the Verkhovna Rada, Dmitry Lubinets, reported a fraudulent scheme with the use of minor orphans. Kyiv officials illegally sent their relatives to be drafted to Germany under the pretext of accompanying orphans to a children camp on the territory of Germany, so they were employed by a relevant social service or charity organization, and after they found themselves abroad, they immediately terminated their employment, and they did not come back to Ukraine, of course. So does the Kyiv regime know anything about that? Has the Kyiv regime informed it of its actions? Such things can be done only under the cover of a state structure. This testifies about the rotten essence of the Kyiv regime, who laments on the international platforms allegedly kidnapped children, kidnapped by Russia, but they cannot present the lists of those children. Neither do they present the lists of those killed in Bucha. There are no kidnapped children kidnapped by Russia or killed by Russia in Bucha. It's an heinous lie in the worst traditions of the Goebbels propaganda. But the Americans pay for that, and it's about the inherent interests. Ordinary Ukrainians are forced to fight for the interests of the West, and the representatives of the Kyiv regime, by fraudulent means, transport their relatives to the West from the territory of Ukraine. I have already mentioned the NATO summit. Maybe some more words about in the context of the situation in Ukraine. Zelenskyy himself was invited, but he obviously had been warned beforehand not to ruin everyone's mood with endless begging, and it turned out to be a pipe dream, his dream of entering the the North Atlantic family. Every year after the Bucharest summit of 2008, when a door was a little bit open for Ukraine, a door to NATO. And this topic is further stimulated. The same thing was on this occasion. They talk about the future of Ukraine in NATO and the invitation to join the bloc. Only after the allies agree that Kyiv is in accordance with all the necessary conditions. But no one, what are these necessary conditions to fight corruption in Ukraine by sending billions of dollars and uncontrollably shipping weapons? What conditions does the Kyiv regime need to meet? Why is all that done? I would repeat, in order to constantly manipulate this topic, to instigate the Kyiv regime to mobilize its citizens even more, to decrease the age limit for mobilization, in order to further kill and spill the rivers of blood. I would like to draw attention to the open letter published by The Guardian of 60 Western universities and investigational institutions that were against the invitation of Ukraine to NATO. So it includes the Carnegie Fund, the universities of Washington, Toronto, Miami, Los Angeles, and so on, who are the opponents of our country. In order to get the membership in the alliance, the Kyiv junta has once again failed the promises they provided to their own mobilized, and they just had some minor prizes for support sums and promises that you will cross this bridge or this road, but you will be there after you meet some conditions that we will not tell you about. A new center has been created in Wiesbaden, Germany, NATO security assistance for training for Ukraine. And there was a decision taken to send the representatives of the alliance to strengthen the ties with Ukraine. It testifies about the transfer to the NATO role as a coordinator in military assistance to the Zelenskyy regime. Before that, it was the group in Ramstein formats headed by the US. They tried to beg in vain for the munitions and military equipment. Zelenskyy demanded more F-16 fighters used on the front. The same thing was done by Foreign Minister Kuleba, who advocated strikes against Russian airfields. And Blinken also spoke about the shipments of F-16 fighter jets from Denmark and the Netherlands to Ukraine, but he did not speak about the details. And according to his face, the statements by Biden were final. Those cynical aspirations to continue by Ukrainians, Kyiv has demanded to continue hostilities without taking into account the losses. And it was mentioned openly in order not to allow the victory of Russia. So let history be of assistance to them, because on the 10th of July, it was 315 years since the Battle of Poltava. It can be compared with the battles of Kulikovo, Borodino, and Stalingrad. The victory at Poltava saved our people from enslavement and returned the Russian lands previously seized by the Swedes. The Sweden army that had been considered invincible. It was a victory for the Russians, and Sweden lost its supremacy forever. And the authority of Russia grew. The victory strengthened its might and international prestige, and strengthened its role as one of the leading international powers.
Today in Stockholm, we have forgotten the lessons of the past and the centuries-old neutrality, which not one generation of Swedes, but many more boasted of, was exchanged for puppet membership in NATO with dubious prospects for ensuring national security. Sweden is turning into one of the leaders in providing military assistance to the Kyiv regime and preparing its population for almost total defense, naively fearing some kind of a possible war with Russia. It might be so, but I don't understand what's happening. Because being a NATO member now, we could think that these are the NATO plans, but I think that we should be honest with your own nation and not to make up this kind of lies about Russia. Ordinary Swedes hardly want a repeat of the Battle of Poltava with Russian troops, and I hope we remember the historical lessons of Peter the Great, as well as tragic experience of Charles XII, Napoleon, and Hitler. Kyiv doesn't like to remember the Battle of Poltava either. It is impossible to falsify its results because everybody knows them. However, you can grossly distort the real role of Hetman Mazepa because we call him almost... You're going to laugh at this one. The first fighter for the independence of Ukraine. Back then. Independence of Ukraine. Just fancy that. You know, even some kind of a drug-induced delirium, which we see at Vancouver now, under this kind of conditions, it would be difficult to fathom that. In exchange for his betrayal, he wanted to receive from the Swedish king a small inheritance in the territory of the present Vitebsk region of Belarus, but this is all put under wraps. Historical documents confirmed that this native Ukrainian gentry changed hands several times over the decades of his career. It looks very much like Zelenskyy indeed. It looks like some kind of a Ukrainian choice. That's what we want us to see this reason like. But the joint forces of Charles XII and Mazepa burned those little Russia's cities, what did not open the gates to the invaders. Its population was completely exterminated. Such a choice, that's a quote, has always been called treason. Most often, the life of traitors ended with the Golus or the block. It looks like Zelenskyy just repeats the path of Mazepa, and they betrayed millions of residents of Ukraine. They are ready to sacrifice their destinies for self-preservation and preservation of power and ensuring the interests. These facts confirm the relevance of the tasks of a special military operation for the nazification and demilitarization of Ukraine and the elimination of threats emanating from its territory. I'll say once again that all of them will be definitely fulfilled. But say a few words about the situation, about this inhumane things happening in the armed forces of Ukraine. And for more than 2 years, since the beginning of a special military operation, we have been talking about the flagrant cases of murders, abuse, and humiliation of Russian military prisoners of war in Ukrainian captivity, which remained without proper attention or reaction on the part of international human rights structures. Despite the fact that there is more than enough evidence of such crimes, international officials always lack something. One day they doubt the credibility of the information provided, or they say that it needs additional verification, or some unforeseen circumstances arise, and so on and so forth. In the case of the bloody staging in Bucha, let me remind you once again that they did not need any additional arguments or verification. And now, with the staging of Russia's alleged shelling of hospitals, we now do want some evidence. However, back then they immediately rushed to accuse Russia without any evidence, any reliable information, or even a list of the dead. There is no list of those people who were killed in Bucha because nobody was killed back then. We had collected bodies elsewhere and then put them around in Bucha. Whether these people had been killed or whether these were actors, nobody knows. However, it's clear that has nothing to do with the actions of Russia. And in the same way, for 8 years, those officials have been blind and deaf to the obvious facts of the abuse of captive militiamen of the DNR and LNR by AFU fighters and nationalist formation, as well as we were blind and deaf to the facts of the killings of civilians and children in Donbass. Evidence of the horrific treatment of Russian prisoners of war in Ukraine is multiplying in public space. I have been talking about this in basically every briefing since the very beginning of a special military operations, and our military correspondents, journalists die for that case, die for that cause, and it looks like now the liberal democratic media of the West seem to begin to understand that. Just look at the New York Times. They had some kind of a revelation. They recently published a piece with the revelations of foreign mercenaries who had fought in one of the Ukrainian armed forces units, the Izbrana Rota, or the Chosen Company. We told of a killing of unarmed wounded Russian soldiers, and we talked of the executions we had witnessed. In addition, the mass media reported that in Czech Republic there is a trial on a mercenary who had fought in Bucha and Irpin. He is accused of illegal service in the Ukrainian army and of looting. During the interrogation, he told about how he appropriated valuable things of dead soldiers and civilians because it was the order of the day, the norm of behavior. Everyone did so. He also reported on the arbitrary executions practiced by his unit, and this is a quote. "We were," he says, "the police, the court, the fine squad for that matter." End of the quote. If yet, the video evidence of Russian unarmed military shootings what appeared in the public domain in 2022 and 2023 to this information, a clear picture emerges. There are numerous flagrant violations by Kyiv of its obligations under the Geneva Conventions on the Treatment of Prisoners of War of 1949, including the deliberate killing of surrendered Russians, torture, inhumane treatment, infliction of severe moral suffering, and irreparable damage to health. These facts have now become routine for the Ukrainian armed forces, which have real facts from among the Bandera and foreign mercenaries among them. However, it still came as a surprise to the Western media, who did allow themselves such a revelation. We note the attempts by Bankovo to conceal the true scale of violations of international humanitarian law. In order to divert attention, including in an effort to cover up the traces of crimes which have already been committed, at certain stages the Zelenskyy regime granted representatives of international organizations limited access to the detained persons, and they call on international organizations, on the international community, on the international non-governmental structures not to follow the lead of the Kyiv regime, not to fall into the trap of their propaganda, not to abide by their mottos, because we see what under the pretext of a guarantee of human rights, they hide the horrible truth of the Ukrainian servicemen and special service employees practicing mental and physical abuse against Russian servicemen. The level of Ukrainian mental degradation can only be compared to the very barbarous times of the past, when, according to historical chronics, according to photos and video, we learned about public executions and public tortures of Soviet soldiers of civilians by the Japanese 731 unit in Manchuria. We performed horrible experiments on soldiers which were still alive, and I am sure that the Ukrainian soldiers are going to follow the steps of the Katomska army of the Third Reich. We're going to face trial and are going to be punished. Russia is working on this, and I will remind once again that those Western countries which send their soldiers of fortune to Ukraine are equally responsible for all the crimes which are being committed against Russian soldiers and civilians. And in our turn, we would like to highlight that Russia is still going to be devoted to its obligations under the international law when it comes to treating those which are held in captivity. We are being held in decent conditions, we are being fed, we are being provided with timely medical care, and I would like to emphasize once again that we're committed to fulfilling our international obligations. And as for Moldova, the Sandu regime is continuing to steer up its anti-Russian hysteria as with all those who want to maintain the contacts with Russia paid no attention to. And on July 6th this year, they had to introduce new rules of shipments from Yerevan to Chisinau. Just think about this. This route became the most popular for flights between our countries after the termination of direct air communication with Russia in 2022, and now, before departing from Yerevan to Chisinau, the air operator is obliged to submit passengers lists to the Moldovan authorities and decide who will be allowed on the flight and who will not be allowed on the flight. In addition, additional security control measures have been introduced at the entrance of Moldova, and the limit for carrying currency has been reduced to $3,000. Inside the country, the authorities are pursuing a policy that Moldovans themselves call the pre-sale Eurotunnel. The artificial diversification of Moldova continues. All of this is happening against the backdrop of the very same artificial barbaric demoldovization of Moldova. On July the 5th this year, a bill was registered in the Moldovan parliament that abolishes the mandatory translation of legislative acts into Russian. Thus, Russian-speaking citizens are put in the position of second-class people, and I would like to remind you that 80% of Moldovans speak Russian to some extent and use it in everyday life. You know, that's the important difference of what's happening under Sandu regime to Romanian language and to the way Russia is promoting Russian language. Never ever can anyone remember anything which could remind us of Russia's orders to replace some traditional language which is used by lots of people, which is an official language, but it should be replaced with Russian. This has never been the case. So we have already talked about that it's important to maintain Russian for those who are already speaking it. But we don't think that it should come as a substitute for other languages. However, look at what Maya Sandu is doing. She basically cancelled the Moldovan language. She called it the Romanian language, and I would say that this is the very basic difference between our approaches, not only to linguistic policy, but also to humanitarian policy and international affairs on the whole. This pro-Western liberal ideology of the cancellation of pretty much everything, for its replacement with something new, of extermination of everything that was of any worth to the indigenous people, of which had been transferred from one generation to another as some kind of a valuable thing, looks nothing like Russian approach of harmonization and the combination of Russian language and Russian culture and the culture which is natural to those people who speak Russian language abroad. On July 3rd this year, during the protest near the court building in Chisinau, Alexei Lungo, leader of a Chance party, was detained, and the criminal cases are opened against the MPs of the opposition. The offices are being constantly searched. Measures taken to tighten control over the so-called unreliable people. In particular, the idea of establishing a territorial anti-terrorist council is being discussed. According to local experts, this mechanism could be used against people who are involved in protest movements. Does it remind you of anything? No. The very same thing happened in the United States when they called domestic terrorists, when they gave the name of domestic terrorists to those who were in opposition to the party in power. And at the cover, of course, of joining the European Union, the development of the territory of Moldova by the North Atlantic Alliance is happening at an accelerated pace. On June 17th to June 28th this year, the NATO exercises called Peace Shield 2024 took place on the territory of the Republic, and from July the 8th to July the 19th, the Moldovan military take part in the fourth seminar of NATO Regional Staff Exercises, Regex 2024. With the active assistance of the alliance, the national army and the military infrastructure of Moldova are being modernized, and the recruitment of reservists has become more frequent. All of this contradicts and undermines the neutral status of the Republic. We all know what this stems from. It comes from the West, and this destructive anti-Russian policy causes rejection among ordinary Moldovans. It is indicative that during this period of Maya Sandu's presidency, more than 200,000 people left the country, and these are mostly young people. According to experts, if this trend continues, more Moldovans will be born abroad than inside the country after 2029. Those Moldovans that are going to be born in Moldova are not going to be Moldovans, they're going to be Romanians instead. And in Moldova itself, the protest movement is growing, and the actions of the authorities push the inhabitants of the Republic. And in order to preserve the right to be called Moldovans and speak the Moldovan language, which is a noble goal, Russia has always advocated an equal and mutual respectful dialogue with the Republic of Moldova. History shows that close cooperation with this country has always been a guarantee of its true independence and the well-being. We are determined to develop dialogue with our Moldovan friends who do not believe in myths about the alleged Russian threat or Moscow's hybrid war against Moldova and other unsubstantiated narratives. These narratives have been popularized by the West, but still we know the truth and we know what we are fighting for. We are fighting for their identity, their sovereignty, and their own future, as well as the future of their children and the future of generations to come. I would also like to say a few words about the North Korea, because it's for the first time in 6 years that the armed forces of Korea held live-fire exercises in the areas neighboring the DPRK. And these measures made Pyongyang retaliate. And it's 2 years in power, the current Seoul administration has surpassed its predecessors in terms of escalation of military tension and confrontation of DPRK. And representatives of the South Korean leadership do not hesitate to publicly label Pyongyang as the empire of evil, thus confirming the unchanged course of elimination of the North and absorbing its territory. Those attempts, in practice, are fraught with disastrous consequences for South Korea itself. That's why we would advise them to stop this reckless war games, and would advise them to step on the path of de-escalation and establishing a mutual trust, which are the key guarantees of a peaceful settlement of problems on the Korean Peninsula. Unfortunately, there are no prospects for breaking the current impasse in the sub-region, and the risks of military escalation are growing. Another destabilizing factor is the growing engagement in the regional affairs of the NATO bloc. We have paid attention to the public statements made by the South Korean leader when it comes to Russia. They were made on the eve and during the anniversary summit of NATO in Washington. They advised Russia to choose between Seoul and Pyongyang. President Yoon Suk-yeol said that they could ship lethal arms to Kyiv in the future in case Russia transfers its military technologies to North Korea. In this regard, we would like to note the following. It's with deep regret that we note that in foreign policy, Seoul is using the NATO taxes of blackmail and threats, which is categorically unacceptable in a diplomatic practice of sovereign states which respect each other. When it comes to the principle of those who are not with us are against us, we would advise it to the authority of North Korea to choose their priorities. We should choose whether we find it more important to maintain peace and stability on the peninsula or to pander to the United States' aspirations to maintain the military dominance in the Asian Pacific at the expense of the permanent confrontation between the South and the North, which could lead to a large-scale conflict. As for the threat to reconsider Seoul's current stance on Ukraine, the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has expressed himself clearly on that at his press conference as an outcome of his visit to Vietnam, because retaliation will follow.
By the way, also regional news, the government of Japan continues to terminate what is left from the bilateral ties with Russia. The administration by Fumio Kishida has adopted a package of personal and sectoral sanctions, the 24th package. Thousands of Russian citizens and 500 Russian companies have been blacklisted. The trade turnover has increased even more, and Japanese officials are acting responsibly, because those ties will have to be restored literally from the ashes. And the influence of such steps on security and economy, our countermeasures will be well considered and not necessarily in a parallel manner. Regarding the Sahel states, we have been asked to comment. I will do this with pleasure. In Niamey, a summit has been conducted, attended by Burkina Faso President and the head of the National Council of the Protection of the Motherland of Niger, Abdurrahman Chiani. The purpose is the security and social and economic tasks, as well as major joint products in financial sphere, including the Investment Bank and Stabilization Fund, free movement of people, goods and services. We consider the Confederation, the Alliance of Sahel States, as an important step in sustainable development and countering Islamist groups in the Sahara-Sahel zone. We think that the initiative of the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger responds to the full extent the aspirations of the peoples of these states. And Russia confirms its intention to further continue its support to the states of the Alliance of Sahel States, including the military efficiency of national armed forces, training of military and legal personnel, and mutually beneficial trade and economic ties. We seldom pay attention to such aspects, but today I would like to mention this aspect. It's such an organization, Youth Ambulance. This organization is in charge of social problems in Belgorod regions and outside that. But you understand what the essence of those problems and the challenges before the participants of the Youth Ambulance. The main task is fighting destructive structures, volunteer activities, including the aid to servicemen, shipment of humanitarian aid. So they resolve the issues mainly connected with the special military operation, humanitarian assistance for the liberated territories and for servicemen, and many, many things. We have got acquainted with that structure not so long ago, around 3 years ago, during the global pandemic, coronavirus. We have much helped each other. We have helped them and they have helped us. So we celebrate the youth ambulance on this another date, anniversary, and we wish you the youth ambulance success, and thank you for your active civil position. Is Международная жизнь with us? I'm ready to ask questions. In France, there have been parliamentary elections. How would you comment on their outcome, and are changes in foreign policy of this country to be expected? We have answered the media questions following the first round of voting. So it's up to the French to decide whether the new composition of the National Assembly and the new composition of the forming government, whether it responds to the aspirations of the society, as the French election system is quite unique, as some parties can get the majority of votes and some parties can get the majority of seats in the parliament. It's just their history. Whether they have supported the left or right opposition, they have expressed their attitude towards the policy of the current authorities. The discontent should be taken into account by the French government. And the French policy, losing its Gaullist traditions. We do not have any illusions with regard to that. As the defense is the scope of the head of the states, we hope that they will adhere to their policy, and we will adhere to our policy regardless of the threats and insults we hear from official Paris. Thank you very much. One more question. How would you comment on the coming Armenian American drills that the Armenian servicemen claim necessary for the peacekeeping missions? It's not surprising, taking into account the domination of the activities by Yerevan within the CSTO and some peacekeeping, peaceful aims declared by the West. Their main task is obvious: to create a platform for the implementation of their own geopolitical projects. It's better to call them pipe dreams, because it's just some adventurous projects. It will only strengthen conflict potential and create new dividing lines. And that could be saved and then compared with the actual situation. It's not just some prediction, it's just analysis based on the actual data. The Westerners are manically involving Armenia in actions against Russia, against Iran, by involving in maneuvers under its auspices, imposing NATO standards of armed forces. That would lead to reformatting of all the security system of Armenia, and the Westerners gaining new influence over its foreign policy and domestic policy. Russia has always tried to find some compromises acceptable for everyone, and such systematic actions undermine the established mechanisms in this sphere. Is RIA Novosti with us? Yes. Hello, Madam Zakharova. We have one question. How could you comment on statements by some Swedish politicians that the recent legislative initiatives in Georgia are inspired by Russian legal practices and move it further from EU membership, and the readiness of Stockholm to further finance the Georgian pro-Western Georgian NGOs. So I would cite a law adopted in Canada. It was just 1 month and a half. It's just surprising speed for the legal regime in Canada. This law includes the creation of a foreign agents roster, limiting the embassy staff, the creation of the Office of the Commissioner for the Control of Foreign Influence. It is an improved and tougher version of the U.S. FARA Foreign Agents Act. So what was the quote by the Swedish media? The recent legislative initiatives in Georgia inspired by Russian normative practice, but can they repeat the same thing about Canada? Because this law is about the foreign agents. The recent legal initiatives by Canada have been inspired by the Russian normative practice. Or do they see the root causes that it has started from the United States of America, who took their 1937 quite ancient law about foreign agents and started implementing that strictly and in a politicized manner with regard to those who were invented by themselves as a threat. Of course, we have noted the statements by the Swedish politicians Anna Lindh and the acting Trade Minister Johan Fossel. I think that on behalf of Georgia, its government will make statements. Whether they consider such statements by Swedish politicians acceptable, we would note stupid and mannered communication by Stockholm international format. That's how they communicate with one of the focused states of Eastern Partnership by the EU that has added aggressive ambitions. Accession to NATO has added aggressive ambitions. And now they are talking to their partners from the position of force, using, among other things, financial and administrative leverages. And those who have considered in Stockholm the foreign agents legislation to speak in the same style, in the same manner with Canada and with the United States. So speak to Washington, to the Trudeau regime, how they dared to implement and develop the Foreign Agents Act. Now they have NATO partners, equal NATO partners, and they can afford such rhetoric in their regard. I will watch that gladly. And the Foreign Agents Act could be also devoted to the problems of NATO and discussed. Is Reuters with us? Obviously, no. Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. Just some difficulties with the camera. We have a question. It's connected with the outcome of the NATO summit, but it's a little bit different. Recently, by the West, so the Baltic states